Classic World of Warcraft is considered by most players to be the least balanced version of the game, where some classes are significantly stronger than others when it comes to endgame content, while others have comparatively overloaded toolkits, which makes them especially strong in player versus player combat. The game's items are no different from this, as some of them have turned out to be incredibly overpowered, especially considering the levels that they were originally designed for. Today we will take a closer look at some of the most impactful items found within the game's earliest version, as well as one that was so overpowered even by the standards of vanilla, that it was removed from the game and doesn't appear anywhere within Classic. This is Vanilla WoW's most overpowered item. In the current version of World of Warcraft, items are standardized and given stats with balancing in mind, meaning that high level items from current endgame usually outperforms lower level items from previous content. But this wasn't always the case, as in World of Warcraft's original version, often called vanilla, there are some items, such as a druid specific wolf's head helm, which was a level 40 leather helm that could be crafted with the leatherworking profession. Despite its level, it was a top option even for max level druids, and the reason for this is that the 20 energy that it gave stacked with the furrow talent to give the druid a total of 60 energy whenever they shapeshifted into cat form, which would otherwise reset energy to 0. Retaining 60 energy whenever the druid shapeshifts into cat form was a significant convenience on its own, but it was actually even better than this because it set the energy to 60 regardless of how much energy the druid had last time they were in cat form. And this allowed for a move called power shifting, where the druid would use spells and deplete their energy bar, and then shift out of cat form only to shift back in immediately, which, if performed correctly, would restore 60 energy to the druid, essentially allowing them to keep using spells in cat form until they ran out of the mana required to shapeshift. There were other lower level items that players considered to be optimal even for max level content, but the most powerful items weren't actually the ones that could be equipped, but instead those that could be consumed. And one of the most well-known consumable items, or rather group of items, were the vanilla flasks, of which there were a total of 5, with the two most commonly used flasks being the Flask of Supreme Power and the Flask of the Titans, which required the player to be level 50 or above and gave a large bonus to either spell power or hit points. It was actually so large that the best flasks from Wrath, an entire 2 expansions later, still gave less stats, despite players' overall stats being 3 to 4 times higher than they were during vanilla. The high power level of the flasks were partially balanced by one of the reagents, the Black Lotus, which all of the flasks required, being extremely rare to come by. And on top of this, the flasks, which were craftable with the alchemy profession, were unique in that they required the crafter to be near an alchemy lab, which initially only existed deep within the Scholarman's dungeon and required a full group of 5 players to access. Later, in patch 1.8, another alchemy lab was added halfway through the Blackwing Lair raid, which was even more difficult to access. While the 3 other flasks weren't that highly regarded and saw little use during original vanilla, the Flask of Distilled Wisdom, which granted 2000 max mana, did actually end up seeing some use during Classic 2019, and this is because players learned that they could use the flask, which increased their total mana to 2000 out of 7000, at which point they could repeat the process, effectively making the flask into an extremely expensive mana potion, but without the long cooldown. As the Classic Hardcore Challenge grew in popularity, another flask, called the Flask of Petrification, quickly became known as the most powerful item, as it allowed the player to turn immune in a stasis effect for up to 1 minute, which was enough time to leave the group and exit the raid or dungeon in cases that would otherwise result in loss of characters. While its usage was initially controversial, it has since become a core part of the hardcore endgame, so much so that some guilds would not allow players to join in for raids if they didn't bring at least 2 flasks of petrification that could be used in case of wipes. During vanilla, some players also realized that some of the items awarded from low-level quests, such as the Bag of Marbles from Elven Forests, which reduced the hit chance of the enemy target by 25%, didn't just work on the low-level targets that it was intended for, but on any target, and this led the item to be used during high-level raiding, in both original vanilla and especially in the 2019 Classic remake, as some of the most hard-hitting bosses like Patchwork in Naxxramas would become substantially easier. For player versus player combat, there were also a couple items that were extremely powerful despite being intended for starting players. The strongest of these, by far, was an item called the Really Sticky Glue, which was the reward for level 6 quest in the Durotar zone, and when used, it rooted the target for 10 seconds, which in itself may not seem too powerful, but unlike other long-lasting roots, it wouldn't break on damage taken and often secured the victory in any melee versus ranged matchup all by itself. Just like many of the other powerful quest items, it was mainly balanced by the limit of 1 quest item per character, which they couldn't replace in any way once all of the charges were used. Despite this, the item was criticized by Alliance players due to the quest only being available to the Horde. But what a lot of players don't know is that the Alliance actually used to have access to a similar item called the Large Rope Net, which low-level players would loot from the Fires Trappers in the Westfalls zone. The Large Rope Net had the exact same effect as the really sticky glue and could also be used on targets of any level. But the key difference between the Large Rope Net and other powerful low-level items was that players weren't limited to one item per character, as they could always farm new nets once they ran out. Throughout the entire game, there weren't really any alternatives that were nearly as good, with even high-level items like those crafted with engineering being directly power-crept by this level 2 item. The gameplay that the ropes incentivized weren't exactly good for the game, and especially not for the newly started players who had their first experience within Azeroth ruined by max-level players of both factions running around and stealing their quest NPCs. So in the end, Blizzard stepped in and removed the item entirely in patch 1.7, making it one of the very few items that were removed during Vanilla's lifetime, and the only one to be removed due to how powerful it was. At the time of the removal, the already existing large rope nets were made soulbound, as players were still allowed to keep and use them, but past this point, no new nets would drop, and over the following months, the item became an increasingly rare sight, to the point where today, most players never even knew that they once existed.